My sister called saying, "Mom died. I own everything." I smiled. She had no idea what was coming. The quiet of a deep winter morning pressed against my kitchen windows, thick and unmoving, but nothing felt heavier than my sister's voice when the phone rang. It carried no warmth, no hesitation, just a flat delivery that made my chest tighten before I even understood the words. Claire said, "Mom is gone." That was it. No pause, no comfort, no space to breathe. She went on without slowing down, passing before dawn. The care center listed heart failure. I have already taken care of everything. I hold the power of attorney and the revised will she signed recently. So the house in Maplewood and the investments are mine to manage. You will receive a small check in the mail. Think of it as something nice for me. Do not call back. I am busy arranging the sale. Then the line went dead, leaving me standing there with the phone still against my ear, while gray slush slid down the driveway outside. 2. The outside world. I am just Laura Mitchell, a woman in her mid-60s who retired quietly and keeps to herself. But my thoughts do not drift the way most people's do. I spent my entire career as a forensic architect, studying failures that others overlooked, towers that leaned, bridges that cracked, luxury buildings that hid dangerous flaws behind polished surfaces. I was the one brought in when something collapsed to explain which support gave way first. And right now, Claire's story felt exactly like that. A structure rushing forward with no integrity holding it up. Our mother Margaret was 85, sharp-witted and stubborn in the best way. The kind of woman who solved crossword puzzles in ink and corrected my grammar out of habit. 2 months earlier, Claire had moved her into an upscale care facility called the Willows, claiming Mom had rapidly declining cognition. I had been blocked from seeing medical files after Claire pushed through a power of attorney during what she called a confused episode. But heart failure before sunrise on a weekday with no call from the head nurse did not add up. I had learned long ago that collapses never come without warning signs. I never opened the envelope Claire mentioned. Instead, I grabbed my coat and keys. If there was rot in her story, I was going to find it myself. I reached the Willows not long after morning staff rotations began. Buildings speak to me the way people never have. So I avoided the main entrance and slipped in through the service bay, following a laundry cart into a staff elevator. When I reached room 402, I expected emptiness, a stripped space ready for the next resident, but the door stood slightly open inside. A figure sat by the window outlined by pale light. My throat tightened as I whispered, "Mom." She did not respond at first. Her frame looked smaller, her hair thin and soft against her shoulders. Then I noticed her fingers tapping against the chair arm. Long, short, long, long. A pattern she had used since her teaching days whenever she was thinking hard. I stepped closer and saw her eyes staring past me. For a moment, panic surged. But when footsteps passed in the hall, her gaze snapped directly to mine, sharp and clear. "Laura," she murmured. Check the tea on the bedside table, sat a cup of chamomile gone cold. I pulled a small testing vial from my purse, a habit that never left me after years of fieldwork. "What is in it, Mom?" I asked quietly. She leaned closer and whispered, "Vitamins," she says. "They dull everything. Make me sleep. I have been pouring them into the plant for days." She is coming back later with a man and papers. She wants me to sign away the lake property. She told me you were dead. She is planning a funeral for me this week. Her jaw tightened with resolve. Then we need to make sure it becomes something unforgettably. Could not simply take her away. Claire controlled the paperwork and would accuse me of kidnapping without hesitation. I needed leverage, something stronger than emotion. I spent the next 2 days working like I was back on a high-stakes investigation. I contacted Daniel Brooks, a digital forensic analyst I had partnered with on fraud cases before. I asked him to dig into Claire's real estate company, check loans, offshore movements, anything unstable. Hours later, he called back with urgency in his voice. "Laura, she is drowning. She took out a massive bridge loan for a waterfront project that never cleared environmental review. Millions owed with no exit. She needs property titles as collateral or she is facing serious charges. She is not being greedy, she is desperate. Desperation makes people reckless." Next, I paid a visit to the facility director. Presenting myself as a compliance inspector, I spoke their language fluently, pointing out safety violations in the lobby until his confidence drained away. Then I shifted the focus to room 402, mentioning the prescription of heavy sedatives without psychiatric history. I let the word liability hang in the air. His face paled, and soon I had the visitor logs in hand. Claire's name appeared again and again: late visits, outside medications, legal witnesses. That night, I returned to Mom's room with a small button camera, something I once used to inspect hidden joints. I secured it near the curtain, facing her chair. She told me Claire would arrive soon. Exhaustion lined her face, but her eyes burned with determination. She thinks she has one, Mom said softly. Let her believe it. I told her every structure fails at its weakest point. We just had to wait for Itai hid inside the wardrobe as the door opened. Heels clicked against the floor and Claire's voice floated in sweet and practiced. Hello, Mommy. I brought your tea and my friend Mr. Sanders is here. Just one more paper for your safety. Mom played her role flawlessly, sounding tired and compliant. Claire guided her hand toward the document, laughing when Mom confused details, whispering to the notary that the signature should be dated earlier, saying she would be officially gone by the end of the week. I recorded everything, every word, every movement, the entire load-bearing lie. That is where the first crack fully revealed itself, and from that moment on, there was no turning back. The night after the recording felt longer than any inspection I had ever worked. Every minute stretched thin as I replayed the images in my head. Claire leaning close with that practiced tenderness, the notary avoiding eye contact, Mom's hand trembling as if age alone caused it, but I knew better. Coercion always leaves marks even when bruises never show. I sat at my kitchen table with the lights low, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, mapping out what came next the same way I once mapped failing structures, identifying stress points, load paths, the exact place where pressure would cause collapse. I drove back to the Willows before sunrise. Timing matters in every operation. Staff rotations create blind spots. Routines dull awareness. I signed in openly this time, presenting myself as family with calm authority. No one questioned me. Authority rarely gets challenged when delivered with confidence. Mom looked smaller that morning. The sedation was wearing her down despite her efforts to avoid it, but her mind remained sharp. She asked me quietly if it was working. I told her the truth, that the foundation was laid, and now we were reinforcing. Edie explained the plan in pieces, so she would not carry the weight alone. Daniel was building a financial profile that traced Claire's loans through shell accounts. I had sent the tea sample to a private lab that owed me favors from old cases, and I was preparing a formal complaint to the state oversight board that regulated long-term care facilities. None of these alone would stop Claire, but together they would create a force she could not outrun. Mom squeezed my hand and told me she trusted the math of it. By midday, Daniel sent over preliminary documents, numbers that told a clear story of risk and deception. Properties leveraged twice over, repayment dates impossible to meet, signatures rushed and poorly masked. I could see the pattern of someone racing against time. He warned me that once banks realized the extent of the misrepresentation, they would move fast, faster than Claire expected. I thanked him and forwarded copies to our family attorney Robert Hayes, a man who believed in documentation the way I believed in structural truths. The next step required patience. I needed Claire to believe nothing had changed. So I let silence do the work. I did not answer messages, did not respond to the envelope she had sent. People like her fill quiet with assumptions that favor them. Sure enough, she returned to the Willows that evening with renewed confidence. According to the logs, she stayed less than 30 minutes, likely checking whether Mom had signed anything else or whether resistance had softened. I returned later that night through the service corridor again. Mom was awake and alert. She told me Claire had mentioned final arrangements, how relieved she was that everything would soon be over, that the stress would finally end. Hearing those words made something cold settle in my chest. Greed is one thing, but wishing an ending for convenience carries a darker weight. I reminded myself to stay focused. Emotions crack judgment. Structures fail when calculations get sloppy. Over the next 2 days, I became a quiet presence in the background, watching patterns, learning staff habits, noting who avoided my gaze and who lingered too long near Mom's door. Corruption leaves subtle fingerprints. I recognized them from years of post-collapse investigations. A nurse who rushed medication times, an aide who accepted sealed bags without checking charts. I documented everything with times and names, building a record that would stand under scrutiny. The lab results arrived confirming the sedatives were far stronger than prescribed, enough to induce confusion and compliance without immediate danger. A calculated dosage designed to blur resistance. I forwarded the findings to Robert and copied the facility director with formal language outlining potential violations. I did not accuse directly. I simply presented facts and let fear do the rest. Within hours, the director requested a meeting. His tone, cautious and deferentially, sat in his office surrounded by certificates and framed mission statements, symbols meant to convey trust. I spoke calmly about oversight, about liabilities that extend beyond civil fines, about how quickly reputations crumble once regulators step in. I mentioned visitor logs and medication discrepancies without raising my voice. His hands shook slightly as he agreed to cooperate fully. Compliance came easier once he understood he was not the primary target. Meanwhile, Daniel uncovered something else. An attempt by Claire to backdate property transfers using a secondary notary tied to her development firm. It was sloppy and rushed. Evidence of panic. He warned me she might accelerate her plans once she sensed resistance. That meant the funeral would proceed as scheduled. A public declaration designed to cement the illusion of control. I realized then that exposure had to be visible. Private corrections would not be enough. I sat with Mom that evening as dusk settled over the facility courtyard. She told me stories from her teaching days, moments of small victories and quiet pride. I listened knowing she might be drawing strength from familiar memories. When she asked if people would believe the truth, I told her belief follows proof. Always has, always will. She nodded and closed her eyes, resting without sedation for the first time in days. The morning of the funeral arrived cold and bright, the kind of clarity that makes lies feel especially fragile. I did not attend right away. Instead, I met with Robert and the financial crimes officers at a nearby office, reviewing evidence one last time. Videos, lab results, financial trails, witness statements. Every piece aligned. There were no loose beams, no unsupported spans. Robert assured me timing was critical. Once Claire spoke publicly, claims would lock into record as the service began at the family home in Maplewood. I positioned myself at the back of the gathering, unseen but present. The yard filled with faces drawn by obligation and opportunity, developers, local officials, acquaintances who mistook proximity for loyalty. Claire stood at the center wrapped in black. Grief performed with precision. I watched her gestures the way I once watched stress fractures widen. She believed she was standing on solid ground when she began speaking about legacy and progress. I felt the final calculations settle into place. Every structure reaches a moment where added weight causes sudden failure. I stepped forward, not yet revealing everything, simply claiming space. The crowd shifted uneasily. Claire's eyes met mine and flickered with something like alarm. She had not expected resistance to take physical form. I waited as she finished, allowing the silence afterward to stretch. Tension is a tool when applied carefully. Then I spoke clearly about records and timelines, about signatures dated after declared deaths, about sedatives found in teacups. Murmurs spread like stress lines across concrete. Claire attempted to interrupt, her voice sharp and defensive, but the presence of officers at the edge of the crowd changed the balance at that moment. The black vehicle turned into the drive, slow and deliberate. Attention shifted instinctively. Doors opened, and Margaret stepped out steady and composed, no confusion clouding her face. Dressed in a deep red suit she favored for important meetings. The crowd froze as reality replaced performance. I watched Claire's posture collapse inward as the impossible became undeniable. Mom walked forward without assistance, taking the microphone with calm authority. She spoke about truth and accountability, about how Isali's trust can be exploited when silence allows it. Her words carried weight because they were backed by evidence waiting just beyond the edge of sound. Officers moved in quietly, not with force but with inevitability. The structure Claire built from secrecy and haste finally failed under the combined load of proof and presence. She sank onto the steps as conversations erupted around her. I felt no triumph, only a steady release of pressure. Justice is not loud when done right. It simply stands where lies once pretended to belong. As the scene unfolded, I stayed close to Mom, ensuring she was supported without being overshadowed. This was not about spectacle but correction. The officers guided Claire away as legal consequences settled in motion. Cameras flashed from a distance, but the real work was already done. The integrity of the story restored later that afternoon as the crowd dispersed and silence returned to the house. Mom and I sat together in the living room, sunlight tracing familiar patterns on the floor. She thanked me not with grand words but with a look that carried years of understanding. I reminded her that structures endure when foundations are honest, and that truth does not need embellishment to hold weight. After the authorities led Claire away, the house felt hollowed out, as if a storm had passed through and taken the noise with it. Chairs stood crooked on the lawn, white flowers bent under their own weight, and the air carried the sharp scent of cut grass and shaken nerves. I walked Mom inside slowly, every step deliberate, the way you move through a damaged building after the dust settles, checking what still stands and what needs care. Inside the living room, Robert Hayes coordinated quietly with the officers. Papers exchanged hands without ceremony, statements recorded while memories were fresh. The evidence we assembled flowed into official channels with a momentum that no single person could stop now. Daniel Brooks joined by phone, confirming transfers and accounts in calm clipped sentences. The machine of accountability turning piece by piece. Mom, sat in her favorite chair by the window, the same one she read lesson plans in decades ago. She looked smaller than she had on the porch, yet stronger somehow, like a beam revealed after false walls are stripped away. I brought her water and adjusted the throw blanket around her shoulders, the shock of the moment still echoing in her breathing, but her eyes stayed clear as afternoon light shifted. The officers departed one by one, leaving behind a quiet that felt earned. Robert assured us protective orders were already in motion. Claire would not be able to approach or interfere. The power of attorney was suspended pending review. Control returned where it belonged. I thanked him and watched him leave, the door closing with a gentle click that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. That evening I helped Mom pack what little she had left at the Willows. Clothes folded carefully, books stacked in familiar order. The button camera slipped back into my purse. The room felt less oppressive now that truth had entered it. Staff members avoided eye contact, some out of guilt, others out of fear. The director signed release papers quickly, eager to cooperate fully. Systems bend fast when consequences become real. We moved Mom back to Maplewood under a sky streaked with early stars. The house welcomed her like it remembered, familiar creaks and shadows settling into place. Nurses vetted by Robert arrived the next morning, professional and transparent, routines established with consent and clarity. I watched Mom reclaim small freedoms, choosing her breakfast, opening windows, correcting my phrasing out of habit. Life stitching itself back together. News of Claire's arrest spread quickly through professional circles. Developers withdrew support overnight. Partners distanced themselves. The same voices that praised her vision now spoke of caution and due diligence. Reputations fracture faster than concrete once integrity is questioned. Daniel updated me daily on the fallout. Accounts frozen, audits expanded. Every shortcut she took, resurfacing under reviewed. The facility faced its own reckoning. Oversight boards launched investigations, licenses suspended pending outcome. Staff members implicated in compliance failures were removed. One submitted my documentation without commentary. Facts do not need embellishment. They stand on their own load-bearing logic. Watching that process unfold felt like observing a condemned structure finally dismantled safely rather than left to collapse on its own. Mom adjusted slowly to being home again. Trauma lingers even when danger passes. Some mornings she woke disoriented, expecting schedules imposed by others. I stayed close during those moments, reminding her gently where she was, grounding her with familiar routines. Trust rebuilds brick by brick. Patience, the mortar holding it together. Weeks passed, and the legal proceedings advanced steadily. Charges formalized, evidence entered, timelines reconstructed. Claire's defense attempted to frame confusion and misunderstanding, but documentation spoke louder than intention ever could. Video records do not forget. Financial ledgers do not bend to persuasion. The narrative she tried to sell could not support its own weight. One afternoon, Mom and I sat on the back porch watching leaves drift across the yard. She sipped tea brewed exactly to her liking. No additives, no hidden hands. She told me she had feared being forgotten more than dying, being reduced to a signature rather than a person. Hearing that tightened something in my chest. I reminded her that presence is an act. Showing up matters. I reflected on my career then. All the collapsed buildings and fractured designs. How often investigations revealed not a single flaw but a culture of shortcuts. Warnings ignored. Expertise sidelined for speed. Families displaced because someone decided margins mattered more than safety. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Exploitation follows similar patterns, whether steel or flesh bears the load. Daniel visited in person soon after, bringing updates and quiet relief. He spoke of how close Claire came to defaulting before exposure, how timing alone prevented deeper damage. He praised the precision of the plan, but I brushed it aside. This was not about cleverness. It was about refusing to accept an explanation that felt wrong. Instincts sharpened by years of reading failure signs. Robert joined us later that week to finalize estate protections. New documents drafted with transparency and oversight. Safeguards layered intentionally. No single point of failure left unaddressed. Mom reviewed everything carefully, asked thoughtful questions, signed with confidence. Watching her reclaim agency felt like seeing a foundation reinforced properly at last. As autumn deepened, the house filled with quiet routines. Shared meals, conversations that wandered without urgency. Healing does not announce itself. It arrives subtly in moments of ease. Laughter returning without effort. Trust settling back into place. I noticed Mom standing taller, moving with less hesitation. The weight lifted from her presence. The trial date approached and media interest flared briefly. Headlines simplifying complex harm into neat phrases. I declined interviews. Spectacle distorts truth. Accountability does not require applause, it requires follow-through. Mom shared a brief statement through Robert emphasizing awareness and protection for others. Her words measured and firm. She refused to let bitterness define the outcome on the day Claire entered a plea. The courtroom remained subdued. No dramatic gestures, just formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Elder abuse, fraud, attempted falsification. Each count read aloud like load calculations, confirming failure points. The sentence followed logically from the evidence. Consequences aligned with actions. The system holding where it often falters afterward. Mom and I walked through a nearby park, leaves crunching softly underfoot. She said she felt lighter, knowing the truth was recorded officially, that no one could rewrite it now. I told her records matter because memory can be challenged, but documentation endures. She smiled and said perhaps she raised me to see the world that way. That evening back at Maplewood, we shared dinner in comfortable silence. The house warm and steady around us, no longer a bargaining chip or asset, but a home reclaimed. I thought about foundations again, how honesty distributes weight evenly, how lies concentrate stress until collapse becomes inevitable. This experience had reinforced what years of practice already taught me. As night settled, I checked the doors and windows out of habit, then paused, realizing vigilance no longer needed to be constant. Trust rebuilt allows rest. I turned off the lights and sat with Mom for a moment longer, grateful not for victory but for stability restored, knowing the structure we stood within now rested on truth rather than pretense. Life did not snap back into place all at once after the plea. Instead, it eased forward the way a building settles after reinforcement, slow and deliberate. Mom began reclaiming parts of herself that had been boxed away during months of control and confusion. She reorganized the kitchen cabinets to her liking, corrected the nurses gently when they assumed instead of asking, and resumed her morning walks through the neighborhood, greeting people who had whispered condolences weeks earlier and now looked at her with a mix of relief and I stayed nearby more than necessary at first, a habit born from years of post-failure vigilance, always expecting another crack to reveal itself. Mom noticed and teased me about hovering, reminding me that structures need room to breathe as much as they need support. She was right, of course. Overbracing can create its own stresses, so I learned to step back while staying present. The legal aftermath continued quietly in the background. Restitution hearings scheduled, assets evaluated, properties disentangled from fraudulent leverage. Daniel kept me informed without dramatics, just clean data flowing into reports. The banks moved efficiently once they saw the full picture. Liens enforced, developments halted, the illusion of endless growth collapsing into accounting reality. One afternoon, Robert called to tell us the Maplewood house and remaining properties were fully protected under new oversight provisions. No single individual could move or sell without multiple verifications. Mom laughed softly when she heard that, saying it felt like putting a lock on a door that should have never been left open. But she appreciated the caretaking community response, shifted over time. Some neighbors brought meals and flowers. Others avoided conversation out of discomfort. Elder abuse forces people to confront truths they prefer to ignore. The idea that danger can wear familiar faces unsettles comfortable assumptions. Mom accepted kindness without bitterness. She understood that silence often comes from fear rather than indifference. The Willows closed temporarily under investigation. Staff turnover, swift and public. Oversight committees cited systemic failures rather than isolated mistakes. I read the reports with professional detachment, recognizing patterns I had seen before in other industries. When profit and reputation outweigh responsibility, collapse follows eventually. Only the scale differs as weeks turned into months. Mom grew stronger, physically and emotionally. Her laughter returned without strain. Her focus sharpened. She resumed volunteering at a local literacy center, teaching children the same patience she once showed her students decades earlier. Watching her read aloud, surrounded by eager faces, filled me with a quiet pride deeper than any professional accolade. I found myself reflecting often during those months, replaying decisions made early on, the moment I chose not to accept Claire's call at face value, how small choices redirect outcomes. Ignoring instinct might have preserved surface peace but destroyed substance. Challenging the story invited conflict yet saved something irreplaceable. Those are the trade-offs. No blueprint can fully capture. Daniel visited again in late fall, this time without urgency, just coffee and conversation. He spoke about new cases and patterns emerging in financial fraud tied to elder exploitation. He said our case had prompted additional audits in similar developments, ripple effects spreading beyond our family. Hearing that reminded me how one corrected failure can prevent others. Mom listened quietly as he spoke, then thanked him in a way only she could. direct and sincere. She told him numbers matter because they reveal intent when words lie. He smiled and said he would remember that. Moments like that felt like reinforcement spreading outward. As winter approached, Maplewood took on a stillness that no longer felt oppressive. Snow softened edges rather than burying them. Mom and I settled into routines shaped by choice rather than necessity. Shared meals, evenings spent reading or debating crossword clues. Disagreements, gentle and affectionate. The house held these moments easily, now that its purpose was no longer contested. Occasionally, news of Claire surfaced through formal updates. Sentencing dates, appeals denied, consequences proceeding as expected. I did not dwell on them. Accountability does not require fixation. It requires acceptance. Mom expressed sadness not for the loss of relationship, but for the person Claire chose to become. Grief for what might have been, rather than what was. One evening as we sat by the fireplace, Mom asked if I ever regretted my career. Spending years examining failure instead of creation. The question surprised me. I told her truthfully that understanding failure taught me respect for what holds. Without studying collapse, you cannot appreciate resilience. She nodded thoughtfully and said perhaps that was why I recognized danger early. Experience sharpens perception. The holidays arrived quietly. No large gatherings, just close friends and trusted faces. Laughter felt unforced, gifts modest and meaningful, the absence of spectacle refreshing. Mom insisted on hosting a small dinner for the nurses who had become part of our daily life. Gratitude expressed through action rather than ceremony. During that dinner, one nurse shared how often she saw families overlook warning signs, how power of attorney was misunderstood or abused, how fear of conflict silenced intervention. Mom listened carefully and then spoke about vigilance and voice, about asking questions even when it feels uncomfortable. Her words carried authority earned through experience rather than position. As the year turned, I felt something inside me settle, a tension I had carried unknowingly, easing away. Constant readiness softened into steady awareness. I realized that while my career trained me to look for collapse, it also trained me to value prevention, strengthening before failure occurs. This chapter of our lives embodied that lesson fully. Mom continued her walks, even in cold weather, bundled in layers, waving at neighbors, reclaiming visibility, presence itself a statement. She told me once that being seen mattered more now. Anonymity had been used against her. Visibility restored balance. One afternoon, we reviewed old photographs together. Images of family gatherings before fractures formed. Mom pointed out moments she missed at the time. Subtle shifts in Claire's expressions. Impatience disguised as ambition. I reminded her, hindsight sharpens edges unfairly. Patterns often only reveal themselves after stress exposes them. As spring approached again, Maplewood felt lighter. Windows opened. Air circulated freely, the house breathing with us. I realized that what we rebuilt was not just physical safety but narrative truth. Reclaiming the story from manipulation, ensuring it rested on verified facts rather than convenient fiction. The experience changed how I moved through the world. Conversations carried more weight. Assumptions met quiet scrutiny. I encouraged friends to check on aging relatives, not with suspicion but with presence. Small interventions prevent large failures. The same principle applies across every structure. Mom noticed these changes and smiled, saying I had always been this way, just more vocal now. She said sometimes surviving collapse gives permission to speak louder about foundations. I accepted that as wisdom, hard-earned. As we planned the coming months, there was no urgency driving decisions, only intention. Maplewood was no longer a bargaining chip or a prize, but a lived space shaped by trust. Watching Mom choose flowers for the garden with care felt like the final confirmation that stability had returned. The cracks had been exposed and addressed, the load redistributed properly, and what remained stood not because it was unchallenged but because it was honest. That realization carried a quiet satisfaction deeper than any confrontation or courtroom victory. Spring arrived gently that year, not with sudden warmth but with a steady easing that felt earned, the kind that seeps into walls and bones alike. Mom spent mornings in the garden turning soil with patient hands, planning rather than rushing, each movement deliberate, as if she was reminding herself and the world that time belonged to her again. I watched from the porch often, noticing how her posture had changed, no longer guarded, no longer bracing for interruption. The house settled into its role as a home rather than a contested asset. Rooms filled with purpose again. Laughter echoed without hesitation. Friends stopped by without awkwardness. Conversations flowed without the shadow of unspoken tension. Maplewood carried these sounds easily. Like a structure finally allowed to perform the function it was designed for, I returned to consulting work occasionally, not out of necessity but choice, advising on failure prevention rather than post-collapse analysis. Clients listened differently when I spoke now. Experience has a way of refining authority. I found myself emphasizing ethics alongside calculations, reminding teams that integrity is not decorative, it is load-bearing. Shortcuts always announce themselves. Eventually, Mom followed these stories with interest, asking thoughtful questions, drawing parallels to her own experience. She said institutions often forget the human scale, focusing on systems while overlooking individuals caught within them. Hearing her articulate that insight affirmed everything we had rebuilt together. Wisdom does not fade when respected. Daniel called less frequently but with warmth when he did, updating me on broader reforms inspired by similar cases. Banks tightening oversight, care facilities revising protocols. He said change moves slowly but it moves. Data accumulates until ignoring it becomes impossible. I thanked him for staying in touch. Connections built during crisis often reveal their true value afterwards. Robert visited one afternoon with final paperwork confirming restitution and permanent restrictions. He presented it without ceremony. Just another step completed. Mom signed calmly, her hand steady. Afterward, she made tea and insisted he stay. Conversation drifted to literature and travel. The normalcy felt profound. Justice completed allows ordinary moments to resume as months pass. The story faded from public attention, as most do, replaced by newer headlines and louder conflicts. I welcomed that anonymity. Resolution does not need constant rehearsal. What mattered endured quietly in daily routines, in trust restored, in choices made freely rather than under pressure. Mom resumed teaching fully, her presence at the literacy center becoming a source of stability for many. Children responded to her patience and clarity. She said helping them find their voices reminded her of the importance of speaking early, before confusion can be exploited. Watching her guide them felt like witnessing prevention in action. Reflected often on how easily the outcome could have been different. Had I dismissed discomfort as grief? Had I accepted authority without scrutiny? Structures fail most often when early warnings are ignored. That lesson echoed through every stage of our experience. Intuition sharpened by knowledge becomes a powerful safeguard. Friends began sharing their own concerns about aging parents, asking for advice, not legal but observational. What to notice, when to question, how to stay present without overstepping. I shared principles rather than directives. Observe patterns, document changes, trust consistency over charisma. Systems protect best when people remain engaged. Mom listened to these conversations and added her perspective gently, saying dignity requires participation, that elders should be involved rather than managed. Her words carried credibility that theory never could. She had lived the consequences of exclusion, and survived them. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching fireflies emerge, Mom spoke about legacy, not in terms of property or savings but impact. She said legacy is how others behave differently because you existed. That measure felt right. The ripple effects of our actions extended beyond our walls, influencing awareness and caution elsewhere. I told her that her resilience had done more than any report or testimony could. Seeing her stand firm had shifted perceptions. Proof embodied convinces where arguments fail. She smiled and said, perhaps teaching never really ends. It just changes audiences. Summer deepened. Maplewood hosted small gatherings again. Nothing extravagant, just shared meals and conversation. Neighbors who once whispered now spoke openly, some apologizing for doubts they never voiced. Mom accepted apologies without dwelling, focusing instead on connection rebuilt. Forgiveness does not erase harm, but it allows movement forward. I noticed my own habits evolving. Vigilance tempered by trust. Skepticism balanced with openness. I no longer scanned every situation for failure but remained ready to respond when patterns emerged. Prevention replaced reaction as the guiding principle. Occasionally memories of that initial phone call surfaced. The flat certainty in Claire's voice, the audacity of declaring ownership through erasure. Those moments felt distant now, their power diminished by truth established. Remembering them served not to reopen wounds but to reinforce lessons learned. In Mom addressed Claire only once afterward in a letter. She never sent. She showed it to me quietly, words expressing sorrow and accountability without accusation. She decided to keep it as a reminder rather than release it. Closure does not always require delivery. Sometimes articulation alone suffices. As autumn returned again, the cycle felt complete. Seasons aligning with internal equilibrium. Maplewood stood steady through storms without anxiety, each creak familiar rather than alarming. I understood then that safety is not the absence of noise, but the presence of reliability. Looking back, I saw how expertise and love had intersected. Analysis guided by care. Care strengthened by discipline. Neither alone would have sufficed. Together, they formed a structure capable of withstanding deliberate harm. Mom summed it up best one morning while pruning roses. She said people think danger announces itself loudly, but it often arrives politely, with paperwork and smiles. Protection requires attention and courage to question. Hearing that from her carried more weight than any professional conclusion. We continued forward without urgency. Plans made deliberately. Trips considered but not rushed. The future open rather than imposed. Stability restored allowed imagination to return. Dreaming is impossible when survival consumes focus. I realized that while my career taught me how things fail, this experience taught me why they must not. People are not interchangeable components. Their well-being is not collateral. Systems exist to serve life, not exploit it. As dusk settled on another quiet evening, Mom and I shared tea on the porch. Comfortable silence between us, the house behind steady and warm, the garden thriving, the world beyond moving on. I felt gratitude, not for conflict resolved, but for awareness gained. The foundation beneath us was no longer assumed. It was verified, reinforced, and respected. And because of that, everything built upon it felt lighter, stronger, and free to endure.